want to ask us about as well. Tomorrow, both of us will be at a housing summit that we have convened here in the City of Toronto, specifically at Regent Park. And I know from our discussions previous to today and today as well that Mayor Robertson knows the challenges that we face on housing, and Councillor Bailão and myself had a chance to compare notes today. But, you know, we both face home prices that are rising rapidly, for many rising out of reach. We have tenants spending more than half their income on rent. We have social housing units crumbling around some of the most vulnerable people in our society, and we have emergency shelters that are pushing 90% occupancy. And so, you know, we've always understood, with that background in mind, how important it was to keep our cities affordable. It's essential to economic growth. It's essential to the health and well-being of the residents. It's essential to the ongoing prosperity of the country. And that's why we have convened this meeting and have done it under the auspices of our colleagues at the Big City Mayors Conference, because we want to come together as a group, and I'm delighted that our federal and provincial ministers, our provincial minister from Ontario and our federal minister for the country, are attending this meeting and taking part in this meeting tomorrow, and we're looking forward to what they have to say. But the fact is, in the last number of years, it's been the cities that have led the charge when it's come to trying to address this issue of affordable housing and social housing. Vancouver and Toronto and some of the other cities that will be represented tomorrow have themselves made significant investments in social housing. We've shown leadership in trying to keep up our stock of social housing and keep it in a reasonable state of repair. And as well, we've created incentives to try and increase the stock of affordable housing. But we'll continue to do those things. But the fact of the matter is, this is a national problem that requires national partnership to address it effectively. And so first thing tomorrow morning, we will present Federal Minister Yves Duclos, and when I say we, the mayors who are in attendance here, including Mayor Robertson and myself, with the core principles that we would like to see in the national housing strategy currently being drafted by federal officials. And they have indicated we see this as a collective effort. We believe there are common measures and relief that can begin to solve some of these very serious challenges. And I think that tomorrow's summit will be an important moment for our cities and for the country. And I hope that you'll all give it some attention. It's a moment being watched by those who are struggling in our cities, the most vulnerable. But I think it's a moment that's also being watched by an awful lot of parents and their adult children who are increasingly concerned about the fact that there may not be a possibility for people to live in our big cities simply because they can't afford it. While this is a national crisis, I think it's important to note that we also need specific solutions to respond to the unique needs of each housing market. Mayor Robertson earlier this year asked for and received, or at least had brought in his jurisdiction, a foreign buyers tax responding to a particular aspect of the Vancouver housing issue. We're obviously watching the impacts, as I've said to you a number of times before, of that policy initiative very carefully here in Toronto, but we need to make sure that we understand the realities of our local housing market before we decide if such an action as that or anything else surrounding that is necessary or, for that matter, appropriate in the Toronto market. It is only responsible, I think, for us to understand what the challenge is here in the Toronto real estate market before we decide to advocate for some particular tool to address it. The Toronto and Vancouver real estate markets have one similarity, which is that they are booming, and that carries with it, you know, prices that can rise rapidly. But they're also very different in some respects. Toronto does not face the same, you know, constraints as Vancouver when it comes to the ease with which you can create new supply. Geography dictates that to some extent. In 2015, construction started on just over 2,100 new condos in Vancouver, while in Toronto there were started 14,000. Foreign ownership of condos, which CMHC does track, was 5.4% of the condo units were found to be foreign owned in Vancouver in 2015 compared to 3.8% here in Toronto. So these numbers that are available just indicate there are differences between these markets, and we have a challenge to understand and analyze these numbers in order to then see how best to address the challenge. And that's why both cities are participating at the invitation of the Federal Minister of Finance, and as I've mentioned to you before, Both cities are participating in this exercise led by the finance minister and with our provincial governments, our respective provincial governments, to examine the housing markets in the two cities and to decide what the situation is in those markets and what might be done, if anything, when I say if anything, in terms of what to best address the sort of affordability and other issues. I will say that that group is meeting again in November, and I'm happy about that. There's a lot of work being done in between, but there is one thing that we've identified as a gap just in the information collecting that we would love to see addressed now, so we will have more complete information. In BC, as I understand it, information related to foreign ownership of single-family homes is collected by the province there, and it's accessible as part of their land transfer tax system. Now, that information is not currently collected, to our knowledge, in Ontario, and without it, we really can't have an informed response as to whether measures, for example, similar to Vancouver's, are necessary as they regard single-family homes. We don't know. And so I'll be asking the province to help us address this information gap so that we can make better informed decisions about what is happening here and what somebody might do about it. I'll just conclude by saying, as we approach this meeting tomorrow, that this is a very important moment, a critical moment for us as cities and as a country in terms of the well-being of our cities and the well-being of the people who live there and the affordability of a home. Whether it's a rental home or an ownership home for those people. And I think what we do next is very important, and that's why tomorrow's meeting, where we have together some of our number from the big cities and some of the housing community here in the broadest sense from the City of Toronto, and our housing advocate will chair the meeting. And I just hope that it is a fruitful discussion, as I'm sure it will be, and I'm delighted that the ministers from the other governments are participating, because I think that's a good sign that they share my interest, and Councillor Bylaw's and Mayor Robertson's and all the other mayors. So on that note, I will, well, before I do that, I want to do this before you talk and you start answering questions. I was saying to the Mayor how delightful it was and how gratifying and how happy it made us to see a sea of Blue Jay jerseys in the stands in Seattle when we were down there for that series just a week or 10 days ago. And it's great that the Blue Jays have developed a significant fan base across the country. And I didn't know if he was properly outfitted. And I'm not going to ask him to put it on because I'm sure he wouldn't possibly consider cheering for any other baseball team. But we're in a key moment now where we need all the help we can get to make sure we have complete the push to the playoffs. And so I just wanted to give you this Blue Jays hat, and I want to give you this as well to make sure that when you go home, you will be properly outfitted to join the ranks of all the people that are from your great city. And to say, I hope you'll say thank you to them from the people here, because it's Canada's team, and they are based here, and we're proud to have them based here, but we've benefited from having all the support from around the country. So there you go. Right on. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Mayor Tory, and go Jays, go. We're looking forward to a great playoff run ahead, and well, once these next 4 games are successful, we're watching closely in Vancouver, right across Canada. So I'll just jump in with first of all, a thank you to Mayor Tory for hosting Big City Mayors gathering here in Toronto this week to talk primarily about affordable housing and the crisis in affordable housing we face in Canadian cities. In Vancouver, it's particularly acute. We have huge challenges from a big homeless population on our streets right up to middle income people and young people not being able to afford to buy a home in the city. We have an enormous crunch in our rental market. So rental housing is in short supply and increasingly less affordable. And that's a challenge that we're focused on at City Hall is creating more rental housing, putting pressure on the provincial and federal governments to support our efforts to get more rental housing and more affordability in the market. Vancouver and Toronto are booming. Our cities are driving the Canadian economy right now. Toronto and Vancouver created almost all of the new jobs in Canada last year, and with that success comes this enormous pressure in our housing market. It also creates pressure on our infrastructure, transit. We have very rapidly growing populations, and we need to tool up in our cities. So I think we've collaborated as 2 big city mayors with a shared agenda to see significant support on affordable housing and transit, and urban infrastructure from the new federal government. We need to see our provinces as strong partners in this as well. It's all through the three levels of government that need to cooperate on this, and we've gone to our fair funding formula of that matches the taxes each level of government collect. 50% roughly federal, 40% provincial, and around 10% local government. That's what we want to see into infrastructure, right? That's the kind of approach that will get a lot more built based on our true economic capacity and our fiscal capacity with our tax dollars collected. So we continue to do that work on infrastructure and transit and have momentum with that. Housing is where we need to pick up the pace. And we're looking forward to this conversation with the Minister of Housing and the head of CMHC tomorrow to talk about the National Housing Strategy. It's great to see Canada finally coming back to creating National Housing Strategy. That's been lacking for many years. But we also need to see some urgent action. The urgency is crucial in Vancouver and Toronto, where we have too many people homeless. We have very vulnerable populations that are not being served by housing or healthcare supports. We need to see much more support from provincial and federal governments to make sure vulnerable people are safe and secure. But we also need to see support for more rental housing, making sure our social housing is protected, the expiring operating agreements are addressed by the federal government. We have a potential crisis on our hands if that funding isn't urgently delivered at a federal level. So we've got some needs in the short term prior to a national housing strategy rolling out that must be addressed. And we're hopeful, based on lots of communication with the federal government now. The minister is here tomorrow to talk about next steps. But we need to see action. That's really what it drills down to. We're ready and willing partners. In Vancouver, we have put 20 public land, city-owned sites on the block to work with the provincial and federal government to create more affordable housing on. That's about $250 million worth of city land that we want to leverage for maximum affordable housing. We're putting what we have on the table to make these deals happen and deliver results for our residents. So we just need to see that same level of urgency from the provincial and federal governments, and then we can start addressing this big gap that's emerged with affordability in our two cities in particular. But it's seen in cities right across Canada. This is a shared concern of all the big city mayors. We've been hammering away on this for several years. It was a big part of our push and advocacy in the election last year. Now we've heard the right noises from the Trudeau government. We need to see action on the ground, and we're hopeful that these months ahead are going to be fruitful. Well, I'll leave it there, and
yeah, we're here now to answer your questions.
Answer questions.
Mayor Robertson, on Airbnb, I understand that you're suggesting that if you have rental that you're not occupying, that you suggest there should be a business license. I'm wondering if you would advocate for that position for Toronto as well. We're starting to see this issue crop up here.
Yeah, well, Mayor Tory and I talked some about the situation with short-term rentals like Airbnb. We have a new approach in Vancouver. The council will be considering next week. Our staff are proposing that we do have a business license for short-term rentals, but that we effectively ban people using short-term rentals in homes that they don't live in. So we're focusing on the principal residence, and we'll give people latitude to rent out rooms or their whole house when they're away. But for short-term rentals, but we don't want to see people basically in the business of that, of what could be long-term rental housing being used for short-term rentals, and basically not only that, but not paying any tax comparable to a hotel or lodging tax. So I think first and foremost for us, we need more rental housing supply, and we've lost a lot of rental housing units long-term into this Airbnb market, and we want to see at least 1,000 of those return to the long-term rental market initially. We'll obviously track it and be sharing our results with Toronto and cities across Canada to help them shape next steps. It may be a little different for different cities. We figure we've looked at 20 cities around the world, and our regime is based on what we think will work in Vancouver, and we're happy to share the data as it rolls out.
I think it's just before we go on, just so you know, and I think you do, we have a report coming from our staff. They've been working on it for some time, and it's coming next month, meaning October. And it's beneficial to us to obviously have the results of the same work that was being done in Vancouver at roughly the same time.